Matt, how's it going?
All good, thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Pleasure. What's your background for people that have never heard of you?
I'd say a failed athlete that became a coach. There's a few of us out there.
Okay.
Yeah, I was a high jumper. I had the dreams of doing something half decent, but I don't know. I think I wasn't psychologically there as an athlete, so turned to coaching, and yeah, just a massive background in jump training, plyometric training, and was coaching track and field for 4 or 5 years before I kind of transitioned into moving into other sports. But grew up as a Brit playing football until the age of 18, and that was the only thing I knew. And then I became a high jumper at 18. It was like,
Oh, really?
You should try.
So you didn't do it through school?
No, it's funny because my best friend he used to go to the English Schools Championship, which is like the biggest track and field thing in the UK for school kids. And he'd go to the finals of that and finish in the top 5. So I was like, high jump's not my sport because my mate does it. So I played football, and then I went to sixth form college, 16 to 19 in the UK, and played a bit of basketball and found out that I could jump, and was actually, I walked down to a track with my college teacher, and he was like, "Oh, this is this guy. He's a high jump coach. So I do some work with him." And that guy was my coach for 8 or 9 years, and is now my mentor. And I've known him for 15 years now. And it just happened to be, one of the most kind of influential people in my life since then. So yeah, it's been a bit of a weird transition, quite different to a lot of track and field athletes. They normally start quite early. And then, not so much within team sports. So it could have been a blessing or a curse. I don't know.
What? How was your training as an athlete? Is there a stark difference to how you would program it now as a coach, or has your come up as an athlete informed how you would coach?
It's a good question, and I reflect on it a lot, and I reflect on even just like aesthetically how I was built and stuff like that. I'm 6'3", built. I was always built like a rasher of wind, like a beanpole. And I kind of had like a semi-scholarship at the university I went to. So I had a big influence from my S&C coach, and he just got me really strong. And my track coach there was a bit of kind of, there wasn't so much of an agreement between how fatigued I'd turn up to the track. But he got me really strong, and I think that it was a blessing in terms of that I didn't actually really have an injury, apart from rolling my ankle once when I put my foot down a pothole. But other than that, I had no real soft tissue injuries until I started to coach and be an athlete at the same time. And I think that was just too much in terms of stress of coaching athletes and trying to coach myself. And I think that was the blessing of keeping me free of injury. Like I never had a knee injury until last year. I was messing around with 2-foot takeoffs trying to dunk, and I've had a sore knee like on and off for the last year. Never ever in my life had a bad knee. So I think that to be a good high jumper, I needed to do more high jumping work. I lived under a bar too much. I think it made me a bit too heavy as a high jumper. So I think that I needed to do more work at speed. So that has kind of shown me the way into, I can get athletes super strong and, the level of what they need to be at, especially for track and field athletes. But I think there's just a simpler route to it. And I don't think it needs to be living under a bar. I think the most important stuff is for technical work.
That would be, again, it's an outsider's perspective. Don't know the data, don't know the athlete, all that kind of stuff. But like, I remember when I came up at the start in pro rugby, Harry AA was the example. EIS would always put a video, oh, look at this front squat, look at this power clean, all this kind of stuff. And then you got Christophe Lemaitre, who ran in the 9.9s, I believe, having never back squatted more than 60 kilos. And it was always like, well, that's great that you want to hang your hat on that, but would you rather hang your hat on a gold medal? So I'm kind of curious. And I think as well, there's almost sometimes like you can surprise yourself with how well some things do work compared to what should work. So I remember I had a conversation once with Craig Pickering, and he told me, you know, before plyometric, he was supposed to be the first white guy to run sub 10. He ran 10:13, and I said, what was your training plan like? He goes, sprint hard as fuck, lift hard as fuck, repeat that 3 times, take Sundays off. And that was his plan. And yet, if you were to look at that on paper, you'd be like, what is this guy doing? But that he was, you know, one of the fastest British guys ever.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, there's stories of it in high jump as well. The kind of joint British record holder, Steve Smith, had at the age of 19, jumped 237. And then he started lifting weights. He didn't touch a weight, didn't touch a barbell. And his personal best ended up at 238. He jumped 1 centimeter. It's always that, like, he jumped 1 centimeter higher with weights. Yeah. You know, whether there's a whole lot that comes into it of longevity of career, maybe that comes in at a certain stage. And, you know, if I can jump 237 or be world class for 10 years, then great. It doesn't matter if I don't necessarily become a world record holder. So yeah, there's a few stories that are thrown around like that. And I think Harry A also went through a period of time where he didn't touch a weight for 3 years, because he went into this, people were telling him, you know, you're strong enough. You can look at a weight and you're going to get bigger.
One of the strongest sprinters in the world. Yeah.
Yeah. Hang cleaning 170 kg, like just crazy strong. And, you know, it didn't really change his performance in terms of his sprinting, and return back to it, but, you know, changed out whether he was doing crazy strength side of things or doing more speed stuff. But yeah, it's the track and field world is such an interesting world to look at. I've got so many coaches that just do real old school circuit based work, and that's it. That's the only stuff they do. But technically, have athletes that are fantastic in the way that they move. And yeah, it's just the perfect experiment all the time from all these different coaches all over the world, especially. And that's why I'm a fan of track and field.
Yeah. You know, I've had conversations with a few guys like around the like Altis world, and I'm always fascinated when you see world records that stand still for very long times. And then because, for example, if, you know, certainly in our lifetimes, if you look at the sprints, there's that incremental improvement in world records over time, like the 100. You know, it's been a while because of Bolt, but you know, for several years it was coming down. There was a big gap with throws where I think the most recent throws world record until Ryan Krauser was like 30 years old. Yeah. And then you see the same in the jumps. Like the long jumpers stood still for years and years and years. And is it Javier Sotomayor you know, his world record has stood for 30 plus years. I've like asked Dan Paff, you know, why is it the 100s come down, the 200s come down, the 400, but not the long jump? And his answer was money. What do you think as to the reason why that high jump record has stood for so long?
The high jump one is money. That's a great one to chuck out. You know, I definitely don't have the inside knowledge that someone like Dan has with the amount of guys that he's worked with at that level. But the high jump one is an interesting one, and there's a lot that's thrown around in terms of you know, whether that world record was, you know, it was at some random meet in Cuba and things like that. But either way, we've had a lot of guys that have jumped around 43, 44. And I think that there's been a generational shift in the way that people high jump, things like that. There's just ebbs and flows of things. It was someone like Sotomayor he jumped 230 at the age of 16. Like, you know, when you're that talented a guy, and he also had 17 ankle operations in the whole of his career.
Really?
Like, yeah, he spends a week on the floor, but his power output was just phenomenal, and his stiffness that he could hold. But yeah, it's a strange one. I couldn't put my finger on it. We had a real dip in the quality of high jump maybe about 7-8 years ago, and then it started to pick up. Then there was some cheats that have been pulled out of the woodwork, and Now it's getting into quite an interesting period, and it could take off a little bit, but there was such a big group of top world-class high jumpers in the early 90s, and it was the same in the long jump. I think that when you look at Carl Lewis and Mike Powell, because both records are around 91, 92.
Yeah.
There was a lot of drugs that were flying around, but there was also I think that there was a pedigree of a bigger base of athletes that were Showtime kind of guys that were in the media. And I think that I don't know, it just fuels things. Maybe money, like you say. Look at the pole vault world record. That will go up 1 centimeter every week for Mondo.
Well, you know the original story, the reason behind that.
It's like 5 or 10 grand every time they do it.
Yeah. So I forget who's the guy. Is it Ukrainian guy that won it? Sergei Bubka. So, yeah, Sergei Bubka. He had it written into his contract. Nike said, "Oh, if you break the world record, we'll pay you X." So he's like, "Fuck you! I'll go out and break it 5 times in 1 meet," and they had to pay him 5 times. Interestingly enough, the person that's come closest to that long jump world record in recent years is also Cuban. He's coached by Carlo Buzzicelli. I remember speaking to him about it, and he's like, "Oh yeah," he goes, "We don't squat this guy at all, ever. He leg presses and he jumps. It's pretty interesting."
I can see it.
Yeah. So obviously, plyometric training, jump training has been a big feature of your training as an athlete, and your learning as a coach. Is what you're known for. Plus Plyos. What do you feel are the biggest misconceptions or mistakes regarding those methodologies that you most commonly see?
Yeah. Do you know what? I think that this constantly develops for me. Like when I look at what those misconceptions are, and it's funny you say that. I'm actually writing an article right now for misconceptions of plyo, so maybe some of them will come up in that. But I think recently the biggest thing is that it's seen as such a separate entity to everything else, and a lot of coaches, their toolbox or however they lay out training throughout the week, it's like, right, this is where I'll lift, this is where I'll do plyos, this is where I'll sprint, this is where I'll do tactical stuff, agility, whatever. And they don't see it as a holistic training method. Like, I don't understand why it can't just be part of dynamic movement. And I would base a lot of my, especially when I was coaching basketball players and track athletes, that it was all part of one. If we had the dynamic session where we did sprint and we did have a base of plyos in and around it, and there was a certain order to that as well, in terms of the spectrum of plyometrics and how I would order that. And I don't think that's done enough. And I think in doing so, it's kind of like, well, maybe I'll just do a load of depth jumps and then just see how that filters throughout the rest of my training. Whereas I think the system that I build is part of everything within locomotion as a whole. And it's about just learning how to land and take off, which is pretty much fundamental in everything that we do in speed and power sports. So I think if you were to take the word, maybe taking plyometrics as a word away from it and just talking about leg dynamics, is probably a better step forward in the evolution of plyometrics as a training method. And maybe we just lay out this large spectrum of landing and takeoff movements and understand the adaptations that come at different parts of that spectrum, and then laying that out throughout the training week, and how we'll maybe bring in different training methods that fit alongside it. So there's that side of things. There's obviously the real basic side of things that, I don't know, I still see shit that's coming out that is not fundamentally plyometric. And I'm like, it's 2021, boys. Like, someone needs to check this bullshit as well. This is what pisses me off. And I kind of just hold back most of the time. So I'm like, oh, I'm that idiot all the time, that I'm the guy that loves plyos, and I bash everyone else on social media. And I'm like,
nothing wrong with it, brother.
So yeah, it's just simple things like that. Really basic sides of it, and understanding that if you're not landing, you're not getting a whole host of really critical things that come with plyometrics as a whole. And I'll keep beating that drum until people bleeding from their ears, because it still is said within top coaches, like who I assume are top coaches and that may have influenced me in the past. So yeah, those I think are that are still number one and maybe number two in terms of misconceptions. And understanding that it doesn't all have to be falling from a box. Yeah, it still happens.
It seems to me like you can easily have a conversation with a traditional strength coach a strength coach when it comes to regular weightlifting. And you say, right, do you think it's appropriate that your first exposure to weightlifting should be a 1RM or, like crazy high percentages? And they'll say, no, it's dumb. But you mentioned depth jumps. To me, that is like the super maximal 1RM of plyometrics training. And then they'll say, I literally, we spoke to a member the other day. He asked for an evaluation of his program. And he said, well, they're doing 1x20 in the weight room, which is, don't give them chemotherapy for a cold, minimal stress, creep it along. And he paired that with 2x10 depth jumps outside of the gym. And I was like, you can see the disconnect here. Why do you think that exists, that disconnect? Is it just a lack of understanding, or? Yeah, it's
lack of understanding of the training method, and it looks sexy. And for me, a depth jump is a testing metric. It's not a training It's not a training method.
Really?
I find obviously there are things to be gained from it.
Yeah.
But if you were to crudely look at someone falling from a box, I think that it's, like you said, it's the 1RM. It's the 1RM.
I mean, if you read Verkhoshansky, it was primarily a central nervous system overload tool, and then that had to be transmuted into the more rhythmic, regular, shorter contact, regular jumping exercises. Is that what you're getting at?
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. It's something that is, well, it's called shock training. It's not actually called plyometrics in its finest form, right? So I think if you can separate those two training methods, you can keep shock training, in a different side of things, and plyometrics can be your ground-based locomotive movement. So yeah, again, people talk to me all the time and say, oh, but Verk said, and I'm like, well, if you actually read what he says, no, he doesn't. Just go through what he's written and just pick apart what he's put down. And actually, I love his work, and I will always use it to support what I do. But sometimes there's also a step forward that needs to be taken from his work. And
if you speak to his daughter, that is the case. She, again, it's so difficult with the translations, and her English is not so good. But I got the opportunity to spend a few days in a room with her almost 10 years ago, and she straight up said, she goes, no, he was wrong about this, and here's why this is better. And she pushed his work forward.
Yeah, we have a webinar where she explains the differences, and at some point she says that there's that PDF that everyone can download for free on Google. And she says, like, this is a misinterpretation of what actually happened. This is not like a progression. They're all like three separate things. And people just understand it as a continuum. And she was like, maybe it's just a language thing. And how many people have trained like that? Like following a language barrier progression mistake. Like, was it loaded drops? She was like, there wasn't supposed to be like the same thing. Or like he doesn't recommend like the loaded drops because of the forces and the absorption. Of course, you're not going to
go. Oh, yeah. So his thing is always like, drop off a higher box, don't load it. Yeah.
Exactly. That's what I mein. And people go like, oh, just drop with like 40 kilos on your back, and that's more power. It's like you break the whole time. Yeah. It's just terrible.
Yeah. So another one is the intensive and extensive categorization and how he. And I wrote about this in the past, about how extensive plyometrics are what he terms of horizontal angular momentum-based movements versus his intensive method, which was vertical, or purely vertical, however you want to see it. So falling from a box or doing more ground-based stuff. And we've got plenty of research now that suggests that some horizontally based movement is pretty damn intense. So things like this, they need to come into the literature, and they need to kind of have that big stamp on it by someone that says, actually, what he wrote may have been lost in translation, this is the start of things. And we've now done a lot of research. I mean, look at triple jump landings, for example. What a lot of my stuff that I'm going to be especially promoting over the next couple of years is looking at how we can add velocity to landings as well, and that influences speed. Because there are two ways in which you can load the body. It can either be from gravity, or it can be from horizontal speed or limb velocity when we're carrying speed, and how fast that limb hits the ground. Because you can spike pretty high ground reaction forces when you whip that foot down. So things like this, again, are maybe lost in translation or just need to be evolved.
So, well, I mean, you and I have talked about, I was going to ask you this later, but we can bring it into this. We've talked a little bit about penultimate steps in dunking and triple jump. Do you think that's like, is it fair to say the more speed that you can carry into that collision with the ground, the more speed you're going to take out of that collision? But then also, if you look at how triple jumpers approach the board, a lot of the time they're attacking with a certain shin angle and lowering the center of gravity to do that. And then
I mean, if we go back to the example of Echeverrio, the Cuban long jumper, and you can look at different variants. I know he's a long jumper opposed to a triple jumper or whatever, but
same
similar things. You can look at some of the differences in jumpers and how their penultimate does slightly vary, and it's the same with looking at different ends of the spectrum of dunkers, looking at the more stiffer elastic guys in comparison to the guys that really stoop down low, and how those influence what's going on at takeoff. And again, I don't think it's brought enough into the rest of sport, and how we look at those influencing factors of, like you say, how are we entering a takeoff, and those external forces that may come just from horizontal speed, how you're actually setting up a takeoff, and how that influences what you're doing with the ground reaction force. So, because a lot of people just use plyometrics and go, well, if I fall from this height, I'm going to get this out of the athlete. Well, 5 athletes do it in 5 different ways. So how are you monitoring that as a coach? How are you monitoring what's happening when you're doing more extensive stuff? When someone looks like shit after the workout and someone is looking fresh as can be, and you've got 2 completely different athletes. So there's a ton of stuff that can come in. Like I spoke to Dan Pfaff a couple of months ago about this, and looking at Greg Rutherford's biggest influences when it comes to jumping 830. And he said it was the distance from his penultimate stride to the takeoff board. If it was too short, he didn't jump as far. If it was too long, he didn't jump as far. He needed that like Goldilocks, like just right kind of takeoff, penultimate step, and how that influenced the way that his center of mass was, how that changed the trajectory of the angle in which he took off. So
I always remember speaking to him about Greg Rutherford. We're both English, and 3 and a bit years ago for CVASPs, they were like, oh, we need someone to volunteer to pick up Dan from the airport. And I was like, fuck, I'll do it. Yeah. So I got the trip to and from the airport with him. And he told me like this, he used to have one big training day every 7 to 10 days. Like he said his outputs relative to his like frame was so big. Like if they tried to do any more than that, he would break apart, which I found pretty interesting.
Yeah, really interesting.
So do you reckon, like, try to put things together that as coaches, even though we tend to find out, we say like the right answer for each athlete, we sort of have this cognitive bias in which we sort of shy away from it, like try and get like the program that, not one that fits all, but fits the most, and it's safer to do in the gym, and it's safer whatever you can think in terms of like sets, reps, and loading and linear or some sort of progression. Whereas you're talking like all these tiny variables that could be different for everyone, which scares us because we'll never really have the answer. Like even if you're Dan Pfaff and you get a new athlete, maybe you've never seen this before, even though you've seen like a million of, jumpers and sprinters. Do you reckon that's why people try to like sort of create models? Like it's because it's safer?
It's got to be. It's got to be safer for the masses, right? Before the outliers are kind of destroying that system and model. There's always going to be someone that just doesn't fit, Charlie Francis's type of sprinting, or a guy that fits running, repeat 200s for the whole of the off season and then getting into the track season and running sub 20 in the 200. Like there's this kind of
apparently right? The Jamaicans just do I had lunch with Stu McMillan, and he told me, I mean, I don't know if it was first hand or second hand, but he told me the way that Bolt trained for the 13 World Championships, and I could not fucking believe it. It was like 50 sled sprints one day, then another day was 300s, and then another day he would go for a jog. Yeah. Blew my mind.
It just, and they all challenge everything we believe. So we're just it's sort of like a clash of identities. Like, well, this guy's the best at what he does. I believe I can prepare the best athletes in the world. He's doing everything I'm against, or don't believe, or don't think it works, and it's fucking working. So who am I? It's just like an existential question. Like, what the hell? I'm a terrible coach.
We know what it is. Like, I reckon that how I don't know how you standardize it and account for it, but like a huge part of athletic success is the match and the relationship between the athlete's archetype and the style of the coach. So you see it with fighters a lot. They'll move coaches and suddenly it's just a click and there's a fit, whereas before it wasn't. But it's like fundamentally they're the same athlete.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you could, I mean, again, going back to Bolt, he would train on grass for 60% of the year. Wouldn't touch a track.
No blocks, everything from a rolling start.
I think he could have done anything and he would have been pretty successful. It's just about keeping him healthy.
Do you reckon he could have broken the world record for the long jump?
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, I spoke to Chidi about that and he's like, yeah, no doubt. It's like, but the thing is like, at what cost, like orthopedically, and could he be bothered to put in the time to do it?
Yeah, I think if he entered the jumps world, he would have struggled injury-wise. I think that he seemed like quite a delicate frame in terms of what he could handle. So volume probably was his best friend, like in terms of sitting at a lower intensity of training. So yeah, again, archetype just rolls straight into that coach's like philosophical stance and how that trains. You're like, oh, I've got this really, wiry athlete that's coming in to do this kind of stuff with a coach. Just doesn't fit the model. Just because you train Bolt doesn't mean it's gonna fit that guy that comes in. I've got a funny example of high jumping in the Czech Republic. I went and I did the B jump, and then all the big boys came out and did the A jump. And some of the boys are like, the Russian Olympic 2012 champ who's now been cut down as a cheat was they were like, what's he doing to get ready for the competition? He's like, oh, he's out the back having a fag.
Yeah.
In between jumps, he'd come back in, he'd be like, oh, am I ready to jump? This guy was just, honestly, it's just such a talent that you get those sort of guys in track and field, and you're like, you could be with the perfect coach doing the perfect program. Sometimes these guys are just freaks.
We have a post on our blog that says, do you want to be right or do you want to have a medal? That pretty much discusses this topic. It's like, do you want everyone to fit in your idea of what preparation should look like, or you just want to find someone and not mess it up? Like, is your ego in the way and whatnot? It's just basically what it is.
What your PhD work, you're obviously, we've spoken a little bit about, you're trying to account for all those things that people miss and how we evaluate athletes and strategies and diagnose training needs. Can you talk a little bit more about that and how you're trying to push things forward?
I'm attempting to try and figure out some sort of classification or some sort of system of this training method. And I mean, some of the stuff that we've been digging into recently, and we've spoken about it, that will come out in the next few weeks, around new testing methods for reactive strength. So I'm trying to look at all the different influences of what we see in landings and takeoffs, and especially for accounting for what's happening before a movement and how that influences what you get out of a movement, the other side of it. So that's going to be a big part of, I think, building the rest of my PhD. And I'm doing that on a professional side of things. That's not even touching my PhD research at the moment. So I'm going to test the waters with it, see if it's bullshit, and then come back to it academically. Yeah. But the kind of forefront of my PhD has been trying to classify some things in terms of a set language. It has been the first fundamental part of it, which I think is going to be really critical for systematizing things, because what you call a depth jump, I might call a drop jump, and every other coach is calling it something different, or they're calling it
exos. Hop is same leg to same leg, bound is one to the other, jump is 2 to 2, but then you see other people programming hurdle hops on 2 legs. And
exactly. So, and I think that they come hand in hand, like the terminology and the misinterpretation is all, they're all married together. So it's kind of nice to look into the history of stuff and understand whether it all comes from our stupid English language. We like to name everything 4 times. Like, do you leap over a puddle, or do you jump over a puddle, or do you hop over a puddle? I don't know. I did all of them. So we didn't have a clue. The bunnies hop, the kangaroos leap. So I set out a language from my mentor, Eric, who uses 4 terms of a hop, a leap, a jump, and a bound. And I try and then structure them into 4 different kind of categories along a spectrum. I don't like to call it a continuum or a progression, because you don't go up it and leave A behind and finish at Z all the time. That's also a misconception, I think, that I could have mentioned earlier, that there seems to be, first of all, I start at loading the athlete eccentrically, and then we learn how to do things concentrically. No.
You got elite athletes doing rudiment jumps every single training session.
Well, you exactly. See that a lot in team sports when people talk about, for example, energy system development. It's like, dude, whatever you're taking into pieces and working separately, they do all together in the game. They jump, they bound, they crash, they decelerate, accelerate, sprint full speed, like aerobic and aerobic. It's like, why do you think that there's this magical place where you just like segment this quality that's separate from everything else, and you work on it and plug it back in again? It's like the same, right? So it's just all, who was it? Hank Kreinoff that was talking about that? Yeah. Like the transfer, and like you can't really like train the system per se and just not do anything else around it.
Yeah. It's like trying to train max velocity speed and not doing an acceleration. Like that's like, you can't do one without the other. Like you're training acceleration all the time. So you know what, as well, I think that we have a lot of people in the industry, and I could say the same myself. We think that we're intelligent enough to be able to do it, to break it down like that. And actually the human body says, fuck you. Like, it's not like that. It's actually way more complex. And if you think that you've got it all figured out, you haven't got a clue. So
what are your 4 categories? Sorry. So you said you have your 4, buckets of jumps, actions. And then you have another 4 categories underneath that. How are they?
Yeah, that's the quote of the chat, by the way. The body says "fuck you" when you.
So the terms go: a hop, kind of similar to exos. A hop is 1 leg to the same leg.
Yeah.
Which I also term it like this: it's a unilateral movement in a unipedal action.
Yep.
A bound is a unilateral movement with a bipedal action when you're moving from left to right.
Yep.
A leap is a bilateral movement, and that can be done in a standard stance or a split stance. And I term a jump a 1-legged movement to a two-foot landing or takeoff, whatever you want to call it. Just because it fits well with track and field, maybe I've just taken it from that. But people like to use the word jump a lot, so I've just chucked it in there, and that's what I use. And if people argue against it, I say, well, that's my language. You come into my universe, that's how I talk about it. So those 4 movements are then set into, they're used within all of the 4 different tiers. And the tiers go, they're a light tier, which is very rudimentary. It's low ground reaction force. We keep ground contact time short, and it's relatively stiff. We then move up into
that's like the classic, like short coupling, extensive, rhythmic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And then we have the medium tier, which is what you class as kind of fully extensive, in that it's a lot more locomotive. You're doing a lot more bounding. It's sub-maximal. It's not completely, fully intense at that given point. Ground reaction forces are getting higher. You're keeping ground contact time short, and it's about moving well in space. And then our kind of most intense tier, which we call the ping tier, just because that's what my coach Eric called it, and I like the word. If you've got ping off the floor, and that kind of looks at, you could bring depth jumps into it, but it looks at realistically everything with maximal intent. You're trying to get off the ground as fast as possible with big outputs, high intensity, big landings from previous movements, and then our fourth tier, which I sometimes kind of, it's not plyometric, it's a supportive tier, which we call a deep tier, which is, I think, it's a really good supportive tier in how it looks after your soft tissue around major joints, and it's the perfect example is a split stance leap, and dropping down into almost like a full lunge where your knees almost touching the ground and then coming back out of it. But there's always movement. There's a deep landing and a takeoff to it. So that structure is throughout. I vertically integrate that for 99.9% of athletes that I have, that I coach, and they don't ever not do one of those tiers every week of the year throughout the whole competitive season.
Is it fair to say, like, the variables that you're tweaking to intensify that stimulus is going to be like intent, force, speed, recruitment of the SFC, like all that kind of stuff?
Exactly.
It's more like an intelligent organization of what other people are doing.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. It's not, I'm not saying that it's reinventing the wheel. It's just a simple way for people to understand where I can fit this, where this will support this, where this can be implemented. And to segue into the level 2 that's coming out.
Yes. 29th of November.
I go into it quite a lot in the chapter that I've written, and it's quite well explained in terms of how you can drip feed bits in. Someone that's not got a lot of time, this is where I can concentrate on more locomotive based movement stuff. This is where I can keep light tier movement in all the time. Like, rudimentary stuff can be part of almost every dynamic workout, and what that does to feed into the rest of your dynamic work. So yeah, having a system like that, I think, is, if it's, I'm a vertically integrated coach. That's the philosophy that I kind of follow.
Anyone that claims to be otherwise is either living 50 years ago in the former Soviet Union or lying to themselves.
Yeah, exactly what we spoke about before, right? You can't do one without having the other. Like, it's you can't say that you're in a strength block, but you're playing matches every week, and you're a rugby player. There's a lot of speed involved, so you're not doing.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things as well I think people forget is, like, again, how we talked about like athlete coach match. It's almost like training program environment match. It would make sense that you would do a block periodization approach where you're probably doing nothing but depth jumps and whatnot. If you live in Siberia and you can't go outside, it also makes sense that you're going to do a long to short program if you live in Jamaica, because you can be outside year round. Why would you be inside? I think that's what people forget. It's like, Mladen talks a lot about this, where you have to consider the totality of all of the factors when you make your decisions. And it's not, you can't just be like, oh, this one or this one, because your situation is not this.
It's funny how you can consider a variable, and the person that actually came up with it was because he was cold or couldn't go outside. And you're thinking like all these mechanics and the body and the metabolism is just like, whoa, the guy was just cold. Like, there was no way outside. He couldn't jump outside.
They did that, and then they were having like competitions to try and touch the ceiling. I think that's the anecdote I heard.
That was my life. And I think that was part of why I was unsuccessful as a high jumper. We didn't have an indoor facility to high jump in that was less than an hour and a half away. So from, if you're in the UK, especially in the South Coast where it rains non-stop, from October to March, I didn't high jump.
Really? You just weightlifted, yeah?
Yeah, I lifted, but we got onto a basketball court, and I would try and headbutt a basketball hoop for 4 months. That was, you know what I mean? Like that. It's it's a smaller version of being stuck in a cabin where there's 5 foot of snow outside, and so like you say, it's
What's the future? You personally in the field of plyometrics?
For me personally, well, we're in the midst of my wife's currently pregnant.
How long until you have the baby?
Beginning of March. So
it's fucking nuts. This is your first one, right?
Yeah.
Right, it's fucking nuts. Everyone will tell you, be like, "Oh, it's gonna change. It's gonna change." You're like, "Yeah," and then it happens. You're like, "Fuck."
I'm nervous and excited. You know how it is.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, we've got this coming. We've loads of things going on in terms of little bits that are coming out. We're revamping our website to add a load of stuff that's going to be kind of supported with just general preparation in as an area as a whole, rather than just plyometrics, but things that aren't within a weight room. It's a little bit different. And alongside that, looking at new opportunities and stuff, trying to get back into coaching people face to face rather than pissing online.
What about the website and social media? Where can people find you?
So they can find me at McInnes Watson on Instagram, and if you want to look at me on Twitter, I don't really understand Twitter. And Plus Plyos, our tags at Plus Plyos, and we're only on Instagram. And plusplyos.com is our website, where there's going to be a lot more educational stuff, and I'm hoping to do quite a few more webinars in the future, and maybe looking at more like a kind of 10-hour course on the surrounding area of plyometrics as a training.
I'll give you a business tip. If you just call it a certification, you can charge 5 times as much. Awesome, man. Thank you very much.
Thank you.